Hi, friends, and welcome back. We are still in the first week of my new series hosted here on YouTube. It is the Play Along Journal series, and this is part 2. So, I am going to start today working in this teal journal. In part 1, you saw me start in the mustard journal. So, throughout this entire series, I will be working in both journals and be posting 2 parts per week. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button and that bell icon to be notified when I am posting new videos. My plan is to post part 1 on Tuesdays and part 2 on Fridays. Also, make sure that you're on my email list if you want to stay in the know. I send out freebies and all the different information that has to do with BB Henry art. Now, some of you may be wondering how you can get your hands on a play along journal, ones that are similar to the ones I'm working in, so that you can play along beside me. If you missed out on that first round of pre-orders, don't worry. I do plan to open orders again in the next couple weeks. I will put the link in the description down below for the journal waitlist. Make sure you're on that and you can stay notified. So I'm starting out on this page, and I just started with some scribbles. The first page is always the hardest for me. I just have that blank page fear, and you look at your journal and you like it so much already, you just have that fear that you're going to mess it up. So my suggestion is just get started. That sounds simple, doesn't it? But it's not always that easy. But one thing that always loosens me up and helps me to get going is loose pencil scribbles. And then you've already quote unquote ruined the page. You haven't. I love the way that they look, but it kind of takes away that fear of what I'm going to do. Is it going to be good enough or whatnot? So just putting that scribbles on the page really helps our mind loosen up and say, okay, it's not going to be so bad. Let's get going. I'm making some teal marks here, and I'm actually using the back side of an awl that I have. This one actually broke, so I got a new awl. But I kept it because I like the marks that it makes on the other side. It's not a perfect imprint of a circle each time. It doesn't take the paint that well, actually, but that's part of the reason I like it, because you can continue stamping with it, but it does look different. Each time that you stamp it down, it gives that look of imperfection, and I really like that inconsistency, actually, in my work, because things then don't look too uniform or look like they were machine printed on the page or manufactured. I want my stuff to have that feel of my artistic style, and sometimes those inconsistencies can be what does it. So keep a lookout for just stuff that maybe you already have in your art studio. What can you use to make marks that are a little different and unique? And think outside the box. Think about the packaging that you get, maybe in the mail or stuff like that. And you can start to think about things and use them in a little bit different ways. Next up, I am taking my Stabilo All pencil. This is by far one of my favorite supplies. It is very versatile, and it also helps get some grunginess into the page. It makes things look not so picture perfect, and that's kind of how I like things. I like things to have that more grungy feel. I don't want things to be too pristine or too pretty. So the Stabilo All is the perfect way to add a little bit of grunginess into your spreads. I dipped my paintbrush into water and spread out some of that pigment. I then hit that with the heat gun. I don't need things to be perfectly dry, but working in a book like this, you do want to be careful of how much water you're adding. That's easy for me to say, not so easy for me to do. I definitely use water a lot in my work. It's one of my favorite ways to change up your supplies that you use on a regular basis. So it can give things a different look. You can add water to paint, give it a more fluid quality. You can give it to the Stabilo All or your different water soluble supplies. I like to think about using your supplies in a different way, and I love how water can affect that. But as I said, in a bound book like this, you do have to be careful because it has the tendency, for gravity. So a lot of times with how the book is, it will run to the middle and kind of soak into your binding a little bit. And yes, it will eventually dry, but you also don't want to ruin the integrity of your book. So it's just something to be careful of. There's always ways to fix that um, and move on from there. If you do use too much water, you can soak it up with either a paper towel, or often I don't have one around, so I just use other pieces of paper that are on my spread. I'm wanting to add a little bit more interest, so I took one of my digital downloads, ripped off a small piece there, and am starting to build a little bit of collage over on that left side. I'm playing with different scraps, different pieces, seeing what works. A lot of times you don't know what's going to work until you take it out of your stash, start tearing it, start ripping it, maybe cutting it, and seeing how it actually looks on the page. Our minds are a powerful thing, and we can really imagine a lot, if we see a scrap or we see a different piece of paper and we can imagine how it's going to look on the page. But sometimes there's really no substitute for taking your page, your scraps, whatever it is, ripping it, getting it down to size so it's not so huge of a piece, but fits into the little book that we're working in. And then you can really picture and imagine how it will go. Sometimes pre-embellished journals are a little bit more tricky to work in. So as you can see, I flipped the back pages of the journal that don't have any work done in them yet and kind of folded them over to the front half. This makes my journal more even to work on. I still have bulk on both sides, but that's why it's better. It's on both sides. It's not just on one. Before I had put a workbook under it to try to level it out. Just play around with what works for you. The unevenness may not bother you, but in some instances it does for me. Next up, I'm using one of my favorite supplies. It is different acrylic inks. This is the messiest supply I probably have, and in addition to it already being a liquid, I like to add water to it. Surprise, surprise. So this is actually how I make a lot of my messy papers. That I then scan in and create digital downloads from. But working directly in the notebook, I urge you to be careful. And a little bit goes a very, very long way. So I have learned this through multiple, if you want to say, failures. They're not failures because I always learn from them, but use just a little bit and come back and add more. It will be surprising how much pigment you get just from a drop or two. So instead of spraying with a spray bottle, which is how I make a lot of my messy papers, I decided to dip my paintbrush in the water and make drips from there. This made it a little bit more controllable and not so crazy. Now that it dried a little bit, I decided that it needed just a little bit more pigment, and going to come back with my water brush and create some of those drips that I want. I'm kind of urging those drips to go in the direction that I want, using gravity to my benefit and letting that pigment spread out. I hit that acrylic ink with the heat gun, and my page is mostly dry. I never wait for it to completely dry. I am not patient enough and I want to continue on, but I do dry it enough that if what I'm doing on top of it needs to either stick down to it or I'm marking on top of it, dry enough that I can keep working on the page. I'm using another one of my favorite supplies now. I've started using this in the past year, and it is a fantastic substitute for a white pen. White pens are so fickle, and to find one that really works, you usually can get one that works over some substrates, but others you have complications, and then the ink starts skipping. This is actually a fluid correction pen, and it creates the best marks, in my opinion. It dries really quick, which is perfect for my impatience. And when it's dry, it actually leaves a little bit of texture, which I love. I always want to find ways to add texture into my work that would normally be just 2D. So by doing this, it creates just a little bit of texture. It makes you want to run your fingers across it when it's dry and you feel the little bumps. You do need to shake it before you use it, and sometimes the nib gets a little bit clogged, but not enough that it really bothers me. As you can see right there, I kind of wiped it off when I was done. Definitely at the beginning and end of using it, you'll want to make sure that the ink is flowing how you want it to. But it is definitely one of my favorite supplies right now. I go back to it over and over, and it pretty much writes over anything that I have tried it on so far. So for me, that is definitely a win. I'm adding a bit more washi tape in that collage piece that I put down right on the fold. It kept threatening to come up a little bit even when I added more glue. So I just decided that since the washi tape was already there on the top, I could add more of it, and then it looked like it was purposeful, even though it was actually serving a functional purpose. I was sifting through my different collage fodder elements and wanted something that could act more as a focal point. And so I picked this botanical stamp, and you can also purchase it in my shop as a digital download that you can print out over and over and use for your own artwork. I sped this up for you guys. I'm fussy cutting right around that stamp. I like the way that this helps it to stand out from the background a little bit, and it definitely takes a little bit of extra time, but with a good pair of scissors, I don't find that it is too much hard work, and actually it can be quite calming to do. If I like to do usually a bunch of them at once just to have them ready and prepared for my upcoming artwork. That is actually how I do a lot of my collage pieces and collage elements, is I do it ahead of time. So I'm outlining with a dark black pen around the outside. I'm wanting this to stand out even more from the background. And so I'm going to make that pigment appear darker on top. So I'm just tracing carefully around the outside and seeing if that step will be enough to really draw it out from the background a little bit more. After seeing what that looked like, I decided that it still was not dark enough. The outlining did not do enough to make it really draw out from the background. I could have just kept using my pen and colored it all in, but I decided to grab a black colored pencil and really heavily kind of fill that in. So I'm actually applying quite a bit of pressure as I mark, just to give it a really dark appearance overall. This is one of the reasons I like to do some of these elements ahead of time, is I'm not always wanting to stop and switch my mindset to do something like this, when before I was collaging and using paint and all of that. I'd rather just have the element done and then I can pull it out of my stash and keep using it. But that doesn't always work. That's not always the way that our minds function, and we're not always prepared with things. So we can't let that stop us from creating. So an option would be to, like I said, get some of those done ahead of time. Another would be just to go kind of through your journal and make some of the backgrounds and then come back with some of the focal pieces. There are so many different ways to work in your journal. And I think that's the best thing, is there really is no right or wrong, but you just have to find what works for you. So I know that I want to put that botanical over on the right side, but I don't want to put it directly to the page. It still needs a little something, a little interest behind it. So I'm taking my pen again, and I'm just going to do a little bit of script behind it. The way that I write. It's very actually similar to my regular writing, but what I do is I make the letters a lot closer together and kind of almost on top of each other. So it's not legible what I'm writing, and that's my goal. But I want everything to still have that appeal of lettering does. So I'm not just making random scribbles, I'm writing actual words. And I think that's really the key to having that script text in the background, is still writing actual words, but we don't need them to be legible. This is actually a good place if you're wanting to do some actual journaling, but you don't want to keep a whole journal that's just for maybe a mind dump or whatever. You can use little pieces of your art journal and you never will have to read them again. And that's kind of how I like to do my journaling, is just getting a thought off or whatever it is. But your art journal is the perfect place to do that. And you can just kind of adapt your writing style so that it's reads more as a pattern than, a paragraph. I'm taking some washi tape and seeing where I can add a little bit more. I can tell the page is getting close to being done, but it's just not quite there yet for me. So I'm kind of tinkering around, seeing what I can do to get it to that final stage in my mind. As I watch back now and seeing this page on screen, I do think that it could have been done at this point. I enjoy leaving some negative space on my pages, but when I'm working on it, I have a harder time leaving that blank space. And I think the determining factor for me was when I closed that flap again. It just didn't have enough interest on that left side of the page. When it was open, I liked the overall feel, but when it was closed, it needed something a little bit more. So I decided to write a quote here, and I sped this part up for you guys because the lettering can take longer and I was trying to take my time. So first I wrote it out in pencil, and then I'm going to go back over it with pen. So I wanted to use a quote that was something about beginning. Like I talked at the beginning of this video, that fear of just starting in your journal or starting something new can really be paralyzing. And so I wanted this reminder as I open the journal each time, that it's okay. We started one before, we can start again. We've done new things in the past and it may be scary, but we're all still here today. So this is just a nice reminder for me when I open this page. So I went over that quote once with pen and it just was not quite as bold as I wanted. And so I'm going back over it again very carefully and making it a little bit more bold. It is very hard to do lettering on camera because the way that I would normally write is bent completely over the page. And so I apologize with my head getting in the frame a couple of times here. It's not always the easiest to film. We kind of realize about ourselves how we may look when we do create at times. Sometimes I get really close to the page and then I have to remember that's probably not the best view for you guys. If you're uncomfortable using your own handwriting to create quotes and stuff, you are not alone. Even though I have done lettering my whole life and I've just fallen in love with handwriting, it's still scary for me to put it into my art journals. And honestly, if I'm right now, that quote is not written exactly how I want it to. But that's the own critical nature in ourselves, is we're always going to be hypercritical. And just to get to the point that we want to get to, we have to start doing it. And so even though it's not perfect, well, there really is no perfect ever, is there? But we're not going to get to that point we want to be unless we start doing it. So, and I think that's the fun thing looking back at old journals, is we can see that growth and we can see how far we've come. So it's fun to have kind of a record of those things. I added just a little bit more Stabilo All, and while there was still some pigment left on my paintbrush, I did a few little paint splatters. I hit that with the heat gun and the page is now complete. I hope that you guys were inspired by this spread and are able to get started in your own play along journal. I cannot wait to see what you guys create. If you have questions about any of the supplies that I use, I do my best to link them in the description below. If I miss something, please do not hesitate to ask. It was probably just an oversight on my part. And I really hope that I will see you on Tuesday for the next episode of the Play Along Journal series. Have a great weekend.